Hey everybody, I've been tagged an awful lot in the following video and asked a bunch of questions about it, so let's take a look. So that video doesn't provide a ton of information, but it provides enough to identify that Bible as a Dilher Bible. So it would have been published somewhere between 1656 and 1788, and probably around the middle of that window of time, if it is roughly a 300-year-old Bible. And Johann Michael Dilher was a pastor and rhetorician from Nuremberg who lived between 1604 and 1669. And toward the end of his life, he began to publish editions of Martin Luther's translation of the Bible that included dozens of woodcuts. That's the artwork that you see on one of the pages in the video. And so there's a library in Stuttgart that has been trying to acquire as many editions of this Bible as they can. And here's a list of the 29 known editions of Dilher Bibles, so the date they were printed, where they were printed, and so on. And again, the video doesn't provide enough data to be able to determine the exact edition, but again, if it's around 300 years old, it's probably coming from the middle of that list. Now, Martin Luther first published a translation of the New Testament in 1522, and then in 1534 published a full translation of the entire Bible as it was known to Protestants, and it included the Apocrypha. And Luther was the first to actually disentangle the Apocrypha from the rest of the Old Testament as it occurred in the Vulgate and in Catholic editions of the Bible. And he set it apart in a different section, originally with a bunch of other books of the Bible he didn't really like the Epistle of James and the Epistle to the Hebrews and the book of Revelation. But it ultimately ended up in between the Old Testament and the New Testament in Luther editions of the Bible, and that's how it would be published for centuries within Protestant editions of the Bible until the 19th century, when it began to be more regularly omitted. And by the end of the 19th century, it was standard to omit the Apocrypha from Protestant editions of the Bible. Now, one of the questions I was asked is how this translation would differ from contemporary translations, and not in a ton of ways. Luther's translation has obviously been updated, and Luther himself updated it several times between 1534 and around 1545, and it has been updated many times since then. So there will be updates that will distinguish this older translation from newer editions of the Luther translation of the Bible. But probably the biggest difference is that up until the 19th century, pretty much everybody based their New Testament, at least, on a family of editions of the Greek New Testament that we know as the Textus Receptus, which began with the Dutch humanist scholar Desiderius Erasmus in the early 16th century. In fact, what made it possible for Luther to translate the New Testament from Greek into German was the second edition of Erasmus's Textus Receptus. The King James Version was based on the third edition of Erasmus's Textus Receptus. Well, at least as they were revising an existing English translation, that was the source text that supplemented their revision. Now, in the 18th and 19th centuries, we see increased concern for the reliability of the manuscripts on which the Textus Receptus was based. We have more and more manuscripts being discovered. Scholars are refining the art of textual criticism. Biblical archaeology as a discipline is becoming more and more mature. And so there are a lot of scholars who are saying we have more reliable and earlier manuscripts. We can reconstruct a better Greek New Testament. And so in the 18th century, we begin to see editions of the Greek New Testament being published that are based on older and more reliable manuscripts. So rather than just lightly revise an edition of the Textus Receptus, they're basically starting over from scratch, which resulted in several passages from the Greek New Testament being omitted because we had earlier and more reliable manuscripts and a more robust text critical apparatus that allowed us to conclude that there are a bunch of passages in the Textus Receptus that were not actually written by the authors of the Greek New Testament. And so in 1881, we had the publication of the revised version of the New Testament. This was a revision of the King James Version, but rather than rely on an edition of the Textus Receptus, it went back to what we now know as the critical text, one of these more recent reconstructions of the Greek New Testament based on more reliable and older manuscripts. And so there are passages that are just completely omitted. Today, there are around 16 passages that are commonly omitted from newer translations of the New Testament as a result of reliance on a different source text for the New Testament. So that's probably the biggest difference that you'll find between this old Dilher Bible and contemporary translations of the Bible, whether into German or into English. And that freaks a lot of people out. You see videos on social media all the time about somebody who stumbled upon Matthew 17:21, which just is not in most contemporary editions of the Bible, and they don't know what's going on. And the reason it's not in there is because we have better and older and more reliable manuscripts, and we know that that passage was actually added into editions of Matthew well after the text had already been completed. So it was not written by the author of the Gospel of Matthew. So yes, there are going to be differences. They're not huge differences. The differences have explanations, and contemporary translations of the Bible are, on the whole, going to be more reliable and closer to how the New Testament likely looked in the earliest decades after it was initially released into the public. I hope that's helpful, and the fit for this video has been Master of Puppets.